Welcome to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Before there were palaces, before crowns and bloodlines, before names like Romanov echoed through marble halls, there was only land. Not gentle land, not forgiving land. Russia begins not as a country, but as a feeling, a vastness, an extremity. Here, winter does not arrive politely. It advances like an occupying army. Snow piles against doors. Rivers harden into roads of ice. Breath itself becomes visible, a reminder that survival must be earned, not assumed. And then, just as suddenly, summer bursts in. Brief, brilliant, overflowing. Fields glow. Light lingers late into the night. Life blooms as if racing against time. These opposites do not cancel each other. They coexist. So too did faith and excess. The deep stillness of Orthodox prayer, foreheads pressed to stone floors, incense curling upward toward painted saints, existing alongside nights of drinking, laughter, and abandon. Wealth that dazzled the eye stood only streets away from hunger that hollowed the body. Silence lived next to violence, order beside chaos. This was the world that shaped Russia long before it was ruled. And in such a place, moderation struggled to survive. The Russian land was immense beyond comprehension. Distances swallowed travelers. Communication moved slowly. Authority weakened with every mile it traveled from the center. To govern such a space required something more than balance. It required presence. It required certainty. It required force. Over time, an idea settled deep into the collective mind, not as doctrine, but as instinct, that Russia could not be held together gently. That it needed a single center, a single voice, a single figure strong enough to stand against the land itself. Later generations would call this essence the Russian soul, Russkaya dusha, something emotional, contradictory, enduring, a spirit capable of patience and fury, obedience and rebellion, devotion and defiance, all at once. It was not easily governed. And so, long before the Romanovs appeared, Russia learned a quiet lesson. When leadership weakened, the land did not rest. It fractured. History taught this lesson harshly. When dynasties failed, famine followed. When authority vanished, violence rushed in to fill the space. Rivals arrived from beyond the borders. Impostors rose from within. Fear spread faster than law. Stability, even imperfect stability, became precious. This did not mean that Russians loved power for its own sake. It meant they feared absence more than control. An empty throne was not freedom, it was danger. And so rulers were not simply leaders, they were anchors. The land itself encouraged this thinking. Rivers froze and thawed without apology. Crops failed without warning. Storms arrived without negotiation. Survival depended on preparation and endurance. These qualities migrated from the fields into politics. Gentleness was admired, but strength was trusted. As centuries passed, this expectation hardened into tradition. Rulers were expected to be more than administrators. They were expected to embody the state, to carry it, to protect it, to endure it. When one ruler fell, the fear was never simply about who would replace them. The fear was that no one would, and that fear lingered in memory. It lingered through whispered stories of past chaos, through prayers spoken not only for salvation, but for order, through the quiet hope that someone, anyone, would stand at the center and hold the vastness together. This was the inheritance the Romanovs would receive. Not a peaceful kingdom, not a settled nation, but a landscape trained by history to expect extremes. In such a world, rulers became symbols as much as decision-makers. their strength reassured, their weakness alarmed. Their presence mattered as much as their policies. The Romanovs would come to rule for more than 3 centuries, but their story did not begin with ambition or conquest. It began with fear, with exhaustion, with a country that had been stretched beyond its limits and was desperate simply to survive another winter. Before them, Russia had nearly ceased to function as a state. The old ruling line had ended. Authority had collapsed. Hunger and violence had followed. The land had shown what happened when no one held the center. This memory would never leave the Romanovs. They would reform. They would expand. They would hesitate. They would harden. Some would dream of enlightenment. Others would fear it. But all would rule under the same unspoken understanding that Russia was not a place where power could drift lightly. It demanded weight. It demanded certainty. It demanded rulers willing to carry contradiction without breaking. And yet, the land that shaped giants also tested them. Because extremes do not forgive easily. The same forces that elevate strong rulers can consume them. Ice can preserve, fire can forge, but both can destroy. The Romanovs would learn this slowly, generation by generation. For now, at the very beginning, Russia waited. Not for greatness, not for glory, but for someone, young, frightened, unprepared, to sit on an empty throne and simply remain there. In the next part of our story, we will step into the silence after collapse, into a country emerging from famine and fear, and we will meet a boy who never wanted to rule, but would be asked to save a nation simply by surviving. Rest now. The snow is falling softly, and history is about to begin. The time of troubles, when the throne went silent. Welcome back to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. There are moments in history when a country does not simply struggle, it dissolves. Russia entered such a moment at the dawn of the 17th century, when the center failed and nothing stood in its place. The old ruling line had ended. The throne, ancient, sacred, feared, stood empty, and emptiness in Russia was never neutral. This era would later be called Smutnoye Vremya, the time of troubles. But the word troubles is far too gentle. This was not disorder. This was unmaking. The land had already been weakened by years of bad harvests. Cold summers had shortened growing seasons. Crops failed again and again. Grain stores emptied. Hunger spread outward from villages into towns and then into cities. People ate bark. They ate grass. They ate whatever could be boiled into something that resembled food. As hunger deepened, fear followed. Families barricaded themselves indoors. Roads became dangerous. Bands of desperate men wandered the countryside. Law, already fragile, thinned until it was barely remembered. And then came the claimants. When legitimacy disappears, stories rush in to replace it. Men appeared claiming to be the rightful ruler, miraculously saved heirs, long-lost sons, returned from the dead. Each arrived with promises. Each gathered supporters. Each was embraced by those who needed something to believe in. One false Dmitri took Moscow itself. He was crowned, celebrated, paraded through the city as a savior. And then, just as quickly, he was killed. His body was burned. His ashes were packed into a cannon and fired toward the western border, as if even his remains needed to be expelled. Another pretender followed, then another. It became a grim rhythm. Rise, hope, disillusion, death. This was not political theater. It was survival instinct dressed as belief. As internal chaos spread, Russia's neighbors watched closely. Borders, like rules, weaken when authority vanishes. Polish forces entered Russian territory. Swedish armies pressed from the north. And eventually, the unimaginable occurred. Foreign soldiers occupied Moscow itself. The Kremlin, the symbolic heart of Russia, the place of coronations and prayer, was no longer Russian. For many, this was the deepest wound. Not just conquest, but humiliation. Proof that without a ruler, the land could not defend itself. Cities changed hands, villages were burned, trade collapsed, coinage lost value, trust evaporated. And through it all, the weather remained indifferent. Winters still came, snow still fell, cold still pressed against walls and skin alike. People prayed, people despaired, people waited. In such moments, memory stretches backward. Russians remembered earlier times of order, even harsh order, and began to miss it. The fear of power slowly gave way to fear of chaos. This was how the idea hardened again, that an imperfect ruler was better than no ruler at all. Eventually, the nobles, the boyars, could no longer ignore the collapse. They were rivals by nature, but even rivalry requires a stable stage. Without a throne, there was nothing left to compete over. So they did something rare. They agreed to meet. The Zemsky Sobor, the assembly of the land, was convened. Clergy, nobles, townsmen gathered not to debate ideals, but to stop the bleeding. Their task was simple in wording and impossible in weight. Choose a czar, but this choice was shaped by fear. They did not want another Ivan the Terrible. They did not want strength that turned inward. They did not want genius or ambition. They wanted quiet. They wanted someone young, someone distant from the recent horrors. Someone connected enough to seem legitimate, but weak enough not to dominate them. In other words, they wanted safety disguised as authority. Their search led them away from Moscow, away from intrigue, away from the city entirely. It led them north, through scarred countryside and silent villages, to a monastery near Kostroma. There, hiding with his mother, was a boy, 16 years old, sickly, unprepared, afraid. His name was Mikhail Romanov. He was not campaigning. He was not plotting. He was not even aware at first of what was coming. When the delegation arrived, the scene was not triumphant. There were no cheers, no banners, no celebration. There were tears. Mikhail wept openly. His mother refused at first, standing before the icons and warning the nobles of what the throne had done to others. She knew the history. She knew how quickly rulers were betrayed, abandoned, destroyed. To accept the crown was not to gain power, it was to step into danger. But the land could not wait any longer. The nobles pressed their case. They spoke of God's will, of responsibility, of what would happen if he refused. And eventually, the boy broke. He did not accept because he wanted to rule. He accepted because Russia needed someone, anyone, to sit at the center again. And so, out of famine, fear, and exhaustion, the Romanov story began. Not with conquest, not with confidence, but with survival. In our next part, we will follow this frightened young Tsar back to Moscow. We will see how quiet endurance, not brilliance, became the foundation of a dynasty that would last 3 centuries. For now, rest. The fires of chaos are dimming. The snow is settling. And for the first time in many years, the throne is no longer empty. Part 3 of 1,000 words. Just wanted to point out that this will flow in one video, so don't write welcome back, as it will go on part by part in one video. Understood below is part 3, written as a continuous flow, with no greetings or breaks, designed to blend seamlessly into the same long slumber scrolls video. Tone remains slow, reflective, factual, and non-judgmental, with gentle narrative momentum. Mikhail Romanov, the boy who held the center. When Mikhail Romanov finally left the monastery near Kostroma, He did not ride out like a conqueror. There were no triumphant banners snapping in the wind, no roar of crowds, no certainty. There was only a quiet procession moving slowly through a wounded land. The road to Moscow passed through villages still scarred by famine and fire. Empty fields, collapsed roofs, faces that had learned not to expect much from the future. People watched silently as the young Tsar passed, unsure whether to feel hope or fear. Mikhail was 16 years old. He had never commanded an army, never ruled an estate, never even lived at court. His childhood had been marked not by luxury, but by instability. His family had fallen in and out of favor under previous rulers. His father had been forced into monastic life and later captured by foreign powers. His mother had learned caution as a form of survival. Mikhail himself was quiet, devout, and physically frail. He suffered from recurring illness. He was not eloquent. He did not possess the commanding presence that later Romanovs would become famous for. And yet, this was precisely why he had been chosen. In a land exhausted by ambition, his weakness felt like safety. When he arrived in Moscow, the city he entered was not the glittering capital of later centuries. It was scarred, wary, and hollowed out. The Kremlin had been violated by foreign troops. Trust had evaporated. Every faction remembered betrayal. The coronation itself was subdued. Ritual returned where chaos had ruled. Prayers were spoken. Icons were kissed. Ancient words were repeated, not because people believed they would solve everything, but because familiarity itself was comforting. For the first time in years, Russia had a czar. And almost immediately, Mikhail did something remarkable. He did very little. This was not weakness. It was instinct. Mikhail understood, perhaps better than anyone, that Russia did not need transformation. It needed time. It needed breathing room. It needed the slow, almost invisible work of restoration. Wars were ended through negotiation rather than glory. Treaties were signed. Foreign armies withdrew. The treasury, empty and disordered, was gradually stabilized. Taxes were collected cautiously with an understanding of how close the population still was to starvation. Most importantly, Mikhail stayed alive. Years passed without coups, without imposters, without civil war. This alone was extraordinary. Behind the scenes, however, real power was taking shape. Mikhail's father, Fyodor Romanov, was released from Polish captivity several years into the reign. When he returned to Moscow, he did not simply resume family life. He was elevated to Patriarch of the Orthodox Church. But this was no ordinary religious appointment. Fyodor took the title Great Sovereign, and from that moment onward, Russia entered a rare and unusual arrangement, a dual authority. Father and son ruled together. Official decrees bore both names. Foreign ambassadors presented themselves to both men. The state and the church, throne and altar, were fused not symbolically, but practically. Mikhail, the gentle and cautious Tsar, represented continuity. Fyodor, the experienced and decisive patriarch, represented authority. Together, they formed a structure that felt unassailable. The boyars who had hoped to manipulate a weak ruler found themselves facing something unexpected. They had avoided a tyrant, only to receive a system. This partnership stabilized Russia further. Religious legitimacy reinforced political authority. Faith and obedience were intertwined. To oppose the Tsar was increasingly framed not merely as rebellion, but as moral disorder. Yet even with this consolidation, the tone of the reign remained restrained. Mikhail did not seek conquest. He did not impose sweeping reforms. He did not attempt to reshape Russian society. Instead, he focused on something far less dramatic and far more enduring. Normalcy. People grew up who had no memory of impostors claiming the throne. Children were born into a world where the ruler did not change every year. Markets reopened, crafts returned. Roads were repaired slowly, imperfectly, but steadily. This quiet mattered. In Russia, where history often moved in convulsions, this long stillness became something almost sacred. Mikhail's reign taught the nation an unspoken lesson, that continuity itself could be power. He produced an heir. He attended church, he presided over ceremonies, and in doing so, he re-established the most important idea of all, the idea that the throne must never be empty. This belief hardened over time. The Tsar was no longer just a ruler. He was a presence, a fixed point, a guarantee against collapse. Russia did not require brilliance. It required someone to sit at the center and endure. Mikhail Romanov became the embodiment of that idea. His reign lasted over 30 years. By the time he died, the country he left behind was no longer in ruins. It was not powerful, not modern, not wealthy, but it was whole. The ship of state still creaked, its timbers were old, its sails were patched, but it floated, and floating was enough. His son, Alexei, inherited not chaos, but routine, not fear, but ritual. A deeply religious society bound together by custom and tradition, a medieval world, still inward-looking, still suspicious of change. The Romanov dynasty had taken root, yet beneath this stability lay something fragile. The land was vast, the institutions were old, the world beyond Russia was changing quickly, ships, science, trade, ideas moving faster each decade. Russia, for now, remained insulated by distance and faith, but insulation can become isolation, and isolation, in time, becomes vulnerability. The Romanovs had proven they could preserve Russia. They had not yet proven they could transform it. That task would fall to a very different kind of ruler. A ruler who would not sit quietly at the center. A ruler who would take an axe to the old ship and rebuild it plank by plank. But for now, the snow lay undisturbed. Church bells rang again, not in alarm, but in rhythm. The throne stood occupied, the country slept, and in that long, quiet sleep, a giant was being born. The quiet years and the illusion of safety. The years that followed Mikhail Romanov's reign unfolded slowly. Too slowly, perhaps, for later generations hungry for heroes, but slow enough for a wounded country to heal. Russia settled into a rhythm that felt almost timeless. Seasons came and went, crops grew and failed in predictable cycles. Trade routes reopened, borders stabilized. The throne remained occupied, and that alone reassured the land. Mikhail's son, Alexei, inherited not a kingdom in crisis, but a kingdom wrapped in ritual. He was deeply religious, more monk than warrior, more caretaker than conqueror. His world was shaped by church calendars, fasting days, processions, and prayer. Under his rule, Russia leaned inward. It listened to its own echo rather than the noise beyond its borders. This inwardness was not accidental. It was protective. Europe was changing. Slowly at first, then faster. Ships crossed oceans. Ideas moved with merchants. Kings argued with parliaments. Science began asking questions that faith alone could not answer. Russia watched from a distance. Isolation felt safe, familiar, almost sacred. The Orthodox Church stood at the heart of daily life. Faith was not merely belief, it was identity. To be Russian was to belong to the Church, to its rituals, its icons, its ancient language. The Church unified a vast and scattered population more effectively than any law, but unity came at a price. When ritual becomes identity, change becomes threat. One of the most telling moments of this era was not a war nor a rebellion, but a dispute over something almost invisible. A question so small it seemed absurd. How many fingers should be used when making the sign of the cross? 2 fingers had been used for centuries. But church authorities, seeking alignment with Greek Orthodox practices, declared that 3 fingers were now correct. This change ignited what became known as the Great Schism. Entire communities rejected the reform. They clung to the old way with ferocity. Some believed that altering ritual meant altering truth itself, that salvation depended on precision. People burned themselves alive rather than accept the new practice. Families split, villages fractured. The state, tied tightly to the church, enforced the change. This was Russia revealing something essential about itself. It was not merely conservative, it was ritual-bound. Its identity was anchored in repetition. And yet, beneath the calm surface, pressure was building. The Romanov state remained medieval in structure. Power flowed downward from the throne through a network of nobles who controlled land and people. Serfdom expanded quietly, becoming more entrenched with each passing decade. Peasants were bound to the land. Mobility was limited. Obligation outweighed choice. For now, this system worked, if working meant survival. But the world beyond Russia was not standing still. Firearms improved, armies professionalized, navies grew, commerce accelerated. States that adapted gained power. States that did not fell behind. Russia remained vast, devout, and slow. It was stable, yes. But stability can become stagnation. The Romanovs had succeeded in restoring order, but they had not answered a growing question. How long could isolation protect a country in a changing world? Alexei ruled gently. His court was pious, his policies cautious. He avoided unnecessary conflict. And for a time, this seemed wise. But his reign also preserved structures that would soon prove fragile. The army remained outdated, the bureaucracy inefficient, education limited, science peripheral, naval power nearly non-existent. Russia floated, but the current was changing. By the end of Alexei's reign, the Romanov dynasty was no longer young. It was established, secure, trusted, and complacent. This complacency created a dangerous illusion that survival equaled success. The land felt calm, the throne felt permanent, the rituals felt eternal. But history rarely moves in straight lines. While Russia prayed and preserved, forces were gathering, quietly, patiently. And in the shadows of this slow-moving world, a child was growing up who did not fit. He was restless where others were devout, curious where others were obedient, energetic where others were cautious. He was tall, even as a boy, awkward, uncontained, fascinated by tools, by weapons, by ships. His games were not quiet. They were loud, physical, militarized. He was born into a world that valued stillness, and he could not sit still. This child would grow to see Russia not as something to preserve, but as something to rebuild. He would not inherit fear of chaos. He would inherit impatience with tradition. And in time, he would look at the old Romanov world, the quiet churches, the bearded nobles, the inward gaze, and decide that it was not enough. The calm of these years was real, but it was temporary. Like ice on a river before spring, the Romanovs had learned how to survive. They had not yet learned how to change. And change, when it comes suddenly, does not knock. It breaks doors. As the candles burned low in Moscow's churches, as bells rang out across frozen streets, the old world slept. And somewhere within it, a giant was waking. If you'd like, next I can. Continue directly with Part 5, Peter Before the Crown. Adjust pacing slightly slower or more poetic. Insert subtle ASMR breathing cues for narration. Prepare a YouTube description, plus timestamps aligned to parts 1 to 4. Just tell me how you'd like to proceed. The child who would not be still. The world Peter was born into prized stillness. It valued ritual over motion, obedience over curiosity, preservation over invention. The court moved slowly. Words were chosen carefully. Change arrived only after long prayer and longer hesitation. Peter did not belong to this world. From the beginning, he seemed ill-suited to quiet halls and measured steps. He was unusually tall even as a boy, all angles and restless limbs, as if his body itself resisted containment. He paced when others sat. He asked questions when others memorized answers. His attention drifted not toward icons and scripture, but toward tools, mechanisms, and motion. Where other children learned reverence, Peter learned velocity. His play was not pretend. It was rehearsal. He gathered boys from different classes and organized them into mock units. They drilled with wooden weapons that were soon replaced by real ones. They marched, camped, learned commands. These were called games, but they were structured, disciplined, and oddly serious. The adults smiled at first. Then they noticed the precision. Peter's childhood unfolded in the shadow of violence. Palace politics were never far away. Guards muttered, nobles plotted, loyalties shifted like snow underfoot. When Peter was still young, an uprising erupted within the very heart of power. He watched as armed men stormed the Kremlin. He saw bodies dragged across stone floors. He saw relatives of his mother killed in front of him, impaled, hacked, discarded. He did not scream. He did not faint. He remembered. That moment etched itself into him like a scar beneath the skin. It taught him something he would never forget. That tradition did not guarantee safety, and that power, when unmanaged, devoured its own. From that day on, Peter's curiosity hardened into resolve. He did not romanticize the old ways. He distrusted them. The bearded nobles who clung to ritual felt to him like relics, ornamental, static, and dangerously slow. The endless church services, the incense-heavy air, the chanting that looped endlessly back upon itself. It felt like time standing still while the rest of the world moved forward. Peter wanted movement. He wanted momentum. He found it outside the palace. Near the outskirts of Moscow, he discovered a small foreign settlement where Europeans lived. Shipbuilders, merchants, craftsmen. Their clothes were different, their manners strange. Their homes filled with unfamiliar objects. Clocks ticked, maps lined the walls. Tools were used with confidence. This world fascinated him. He learned by watching, then by doing. He dismantled things just to see how they worked. He learned to measure, to hammer, to assemble. His hands became as important to him as his authority would later become. He did not see labor as beneath him. He saw it as knowledge. While courtiers whispered and priests warned, Peter learned. As he grew older, the scale of his ambitions expanded. His childhood regiments became real forces. His curiosity became hunger. His impatience became vision. Russia, he decided, was asleep. Not dead, not weak, but sleeping while others advanced. Beyond its borders, nations were building ships that crossed oceans. Armies trained with new formations. Science questioned old assumptions. Trade reshaped wealth. Power was shifting, not slowly, but decisively. Russia stood vast and immobile. Peter did not want to preserve this stillness. He wanted to break it. Yet even as his mind raced ahead, his position remained constrained. He was not yet fully in control. Regents ruled, advisors stalled, tradition held firm. So Peter waited and prepared. He studied foreign weapons. He observed military drills. He surrounded himself with people who knew how to build, how to calculate, how to navigate. He drank with sailors. He listened to engineers. He absorbed everything. He was building something inside himself, a conviction that Russia could not simply adjust. It would need to be remade. This was not rebellion against his family. It was rebellion against inertia. By the time Peter reached adulthood, the contrast between him and the world around him was unmistakable. He towered physically and ideologically. He spoke bluntly. He laughed loudly. He worked obsessively. He did not fear the unfamiliar. He sought it out. And most importantly, he was willing to offend tradition, offend ritual, offend comfort. To Peter, offense was a small price to pay for survival. He believed that Russia stood at a crossroads, not of ideology, but of time. That it could not remain what it was and still endure. That it must learn from others without becoming them entirely. He did not yet know how he would do this, but he knew that waiting was no longer an option. The child who would not be still had become a young man who could not be restrained. The quiet Romanov world, the candles, the chants, the inward gaze, had given Russia time to heal. But Peter saw that healing was not enough. The future was approaching quickly, and he intended to meet it head-on. In the next part of our story, Peter will step beyond Russia's borders, not as a conqueror, but as a student. He will leave behind the robes of ceremony and take up the tools of labor. The Tsar will disappear, and in his place, a shipwright will emerge. For now, the night deepens, the old world sleeps, and the gears of change begin, softly, to turn. The Tsar who disappeared. When Peter finally left Russia, he did not do so as a monarch seeking admiration. He left as a man hungry to learn. In 1697, an announcement was made of a grand diplomatic mission to Europe. Officially, it was a journey to secure alliances and study foreign courts. In truth, it was something far stranger. It was the most unconventional education any ruler had ever undertaken. Peter did not travel as Peter, Tsar of all the Russias. He traveled as a nobody, or at least he tried to. He adopted the name Pyotr Mikhailov and insisted on being treated as an ordinary member of the delegation. This disguise fooled no one. A man nearly 7 feet tall with a nervous facial twitch and a booming voice is difficult to overlook. Yet Peter did not care whether he was recognized. He cared only that he was ignored. He did not attend balls unless forced. He avoided ceremony. He skipped formal receptions whenever possible. Instead, he went to docks, to workshops, to foundries, to shipyards. In the Dutch Republic, he found what he had been searching for. Amsterdam was alive with movement, canals crowded with ships, timber stacked high. The air rang with the sound of hammers striking wood and iron. Here, Peter did not watch from a distance. He worked. He lived in a small, cramped cottage. He rose early. He labored alongside ordinary shipwrights, learning how hulls were shaped, how masts were set, how seams were sealed. He blistered his hands. He ruined clothes. He asked endless questions. This was not symbolic labor. It was apprenticeship. Peter learned how ships were designed not as ornaments, but as tools of power. He learned how naval strength allowed small nations to project influence far beyond their borders. He understood, viscerally, that water was not an obstacle. It was a road. Russia, landlocked and inward-looking, had no such roads. Peter intended to change that. From the Netherlands, he traveled onward. In England, he studied naval architecture in greater depth. He toured docks and arsenals. He visited factories. He observed the organization of labor, the standardization of parts, the discipline of schedules. He went to the Royal Mint to learn how coinage was produced and controlled. He understood that money was not just metal, it was trust, regulation, and authority. He even took up dentistry. It began as curiosity. It became obsession. Peter practiced by pulling the teeth of his own courtiers, sometimes without asking first. Perfectly healthy teeth were sacrificed in the name of skill. He kept the extracted teeth as trophies, each one a reminder that no knowledge was too small, no skill beneath him. Peter collected people as much as ideas, engineers, artisans, officers, doctors. He invited them to Russia, offering positions, salaries, protection. He did not want books describing progress. He wanted living embodiments of it. Everywhere he went, Peter absorbed systems, how cities were governed, how armies were trained, how supplies were moved, how discipline was enforced. He compared what he saw to what he knew of Russia. The contrast was painful. Russia relied on tradition. Europe relied on method. Russia trusted hierarchy. Europe trusted specialization. Russia moved slowly. Europe moved efficiently. This journey changed Peter irrevocably. He was no longer merely dissatisfied. He was convinced. Russia could not imitate Europe piece by piece. It could not gently adopt practices over generations. It would never catch up that way. It needed shock. It needed compression. It needed to be forced forward in time. By the time Peter returned home, he carried more than notebooks and tools. He carried impatience sharpened into resolve. He had seen what was possible. He had seen what Russia was missing, and he had no intention of asking permission to change it. The moment his feet touched Russian soil again, the contrast struck him violently. The long robes, the beards, the rituals that consumed hours without producing motion. To Peter, it felt like stepping backward through centuries. He had left as a curious ruler. He returned as a revolutionary. Not one who believed in persuasion, but one who believed in compulsion. He would not reform Russia. He would melt it down and reshape it. And the first battles would not be fought with foreign armies. They would be fought at home, against habits, against symbols, against the visible markers of the old world. The journey had taught Peter something essential, that power was not inherited. It was constructed, engineered, maintained through systems and skills. Russia had land, it had people, it had endurance. What it lacked was structure. Peter was about to provide it. The old, quiet Romanov rhythm, the slow prayers, the unchanging forms, was coming to an end. The Tsar who had disappeared into Europe was gone. In his place stood a man who had measured the world and found his country wanting. The tools were ready, the plans were forming, and the first cuts would be deep. As the night deepens, the sound of hammers echoes faintly in the distance. Russia is about to be reforged. The war on appearances. Peter did not begin his transformation of Russia with laws. He began with faces. When the nobles gathered for a celebration soon after his return, they expected ceremony. They expected speeches. They expected blessings. Instead, they received scissors. Peter moved through the room like a force of nature, laughing loudly, grabbing men by the chin, and hacking away at their long beards with his own hands. Hair fell to the floor in uneven clumps. Some men protested, some froze in terror, others laughed nervously, hoping to turn humiliation into humor. For centuries, the beard had been sacred. It was not fashion, it was theology. To wear a beard was to resemble the saints. To shave it was to defy tradition, and for many, to risk one's soul. Peter did not argue theology. He cut. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was declaration. He wanted the old world to feel exposed, vulnerable, stripped of its symbols. He understood something instinctively, that appearances anchor identity. If you change how people look, you unsettle how they think. Soon, the shock became policy. A tax was imposed on beards. Any man who wished to keep his facial hair had to pay for the privilege. In return, he received a small metal token declaring that the beard was a superfluous burden. The message was unmistakable. Tradition was no longer sacred. It was taxable. Clothing followed. Long robes were replaced with fitted coats modeled after European styles. Sleeves shortened. Buttons appeared. Movement became easier. The body itself was freed from fabric designed for stillness. The change was uncomfortable, intentional. Peter wanted the nobility to feel out of place in their own skin. Then came time itself. For generations, Russia had measured years differently from the rest of Europe. The calendar marked time from the creation of the world. New Year's Day fell in early autumn. Peter shifted it. The year would now begin on January 1st. The numbering system changed. Fireworks were ordered, celebrations mandated. Time was being realigned. This was not about dates. It was about synchronization. Peter was forcing Russia to tick in rhythm with the wider world. These reforms felt trivial to outsiders. Hairstyles, clothing, calendars. But to those living through them, they were profound disruptions. Each change chipped away at the sense that Russia existed apart, untouched by external influence. Resistance simmered quietly. Priests muttered. Boyars complained behind closed doors. Peasants watched with confusion. Many did not understand why their ruler cared so much about sleeves and beards when fields still needed tending and taxes still needed paying. But Peter understood something they did not yet see. Symbols are infrastructure. They shape behavior long before laws do, and Peter was preparing Russia for something far larger than fashion. While nobles argued over coats and beards, Peter's true obsession sharpened: war. Russia remained landlocked. Its vast rivers froze for months at a time. Trade depended on intermediaries. Naval power was almost non-existent. In an age where ships carried armies and empires, Russia stood on the shore, watching. Peter would not accept this. To become a power, Russia needed access to the sea, warm water ports, a navy, a way out. The nearest path lay through the Baltic. At that time, the Baltic was dominated by Sweden, a disciplined, efficient military state led by a young king renowned for his battlefield skill. To challenge Sweden was to challenge a European power at its height. Peter challenged it anyway. The Great Northern War began with optimism and ended in humiliation, at least at first. Russian forces met the Swedish army at Narva and collapsed. The defeat was swift and devastating. Soldiers fled. Commanders faltered. The army Peter had been building fell apart under pressure. Many rulers would have retreated. Peter doubled down. He did not deny failure. He consumed it. If Russia lacked cannons, he would make them. If bronze was needed, he would find it. Church bells were melted down and recast into artillery. Sacred metal became weapons. Peasants were conscripted in unprecedented numbers. One man from every household. For life, training intensified, discipline hardened. The army was rebuilt not as a feudal levy, but as a permanent institution. Years passed, the war dragged on, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Russia changed. The army learned, the officers adapted, supply lines improved. The state itself became more efficient, more demanding, more capable. Then came Poltava. In 1709, Russian forces met the Swedish army again. This time, the outcome was different. The battle was brutal, decisive, and transformative. Sweden's power was broken. Russia emerged not merely victorious, but altered. It was no longer an outsider. It was an empire. The war had proven Peter's belief that Russia could not drift into modernity. It had to be driven. The cost was immense. Lives were consumed, resources exhausted, traditions dismantled. But Peter measured success not in comfort, but in capacity. By reshaping appearances, he had softened resistance to deeper change. By forcing discomfort, he had broken complacency. By enduring defeat, he had built resilience. Russia was no longer asleep. It was marching. And now, with victory secured, Peter turned to his most audacious vision yet. A city not born of history, but of will. A capital that would face outward rather than inward. A monument not to faith or tradition, but to power, discipline, and permanence. The river waited. The swamp lay silent. And Peter was already imagining stone rising from water. The reshaping of Russia was far from over. It was only beginning. A city against the land victory did not soften Peter. It sharpened him. After Poltava, the future seemed suddenly visible, clear, demanding, impatient. Russia had proven it could fight. Now Peter wanted it to stand, to look outward, to anchor itself in the world he had studied with his own hands. For that, he needed a symbol. Moscow would not do. Moscow was memory. Moscow was inward-facing. Moscow was ritual and inheritance and slow-burning tradition. Peter wanted something else entirely. He wanted a city that faced the sea. So he chose a place that almost no one else would have chosen. A low, swampy stretch of land at the mouth of the Neva River, wind-scoured, flood-prone, malarial, claimed only recently from Sweden and barely held. To Peter, it was perfect. This would not be a city that grew naturally over centuries. It would be created, designed, forced into existence by will alone. A capital that owed nothing to history and everything to intention. In 1703, Peter laid the first stone. He called the city St. Petersburg, a name that sounded foreign even to Russian ears. Deliberately so. The land resisted immediately. The ground was soft and treacherous. Water seeped everywhere. Foundations sank. Wood rotted. Insects thrived. Winters were brutal. Summers humid and diseased. But resistance only confirmed Peter's resolve. Tens of thousands of laborers were ordered to the site. Serfs from across the empire. Soldiers, prisoners of war. Craftsmen conscripted from their villages. They came with few tools and less protection. They dug canals with their hands. They hauled stone through mud. They worked waist-deep in water. Many did not survive. Disease spread quickly. Malaria, dysentery, scurvy. Bodies were buried where they fell, sometimes not buried at all. The city rose layer by layer, wood and stone pressed down over bone. Later generations would call it a city built on bones. Peter did not deny the cost. He accepted it. To him, this was not cruelty. It was necessity. He believed history itself demanded sacrifice, and Russia had always paid in lives. Nobles were ordered to move to the new city. They resisted at first, clinging to their estates near Moscow. Peter responded with decrees. If they wanted influence, they would live where the capital lived. They were commanded to build houses, stone houses, not wood, at their own expense. The city filled with half-finished palaces, damp rooms, drafty corridors, and resentment. St. Petersburg became many things at once: a window to Europe, a symbol of modernity, and a gilded prison. From here, Russia would face outward. Ships would sail, trade would flow. Diplomats would arrive by water, not road. The empire would announce itself not through tradition, but through presence. Peter moved the capital officially. The center of gravity shifted. Russia turned its back, partially, on its old self. But even as the city rose, another conflict unfolded, quieter, more intimate, and far more painful. Peter had remade institutions, he had reshaped culture, he had built armies and cities, but he could not remake blood. His son, Alexei, had grown up in the shadow of these changes, and he hated them. Alexei was everything Peter was not. Where Peter was restless, Alexei was withdrawn. Where Peter was curious, Alexei was fearful. Where Peter embraced the new, Alexei clung to the old. He was deeply religious, comfortable with ritual, loyal to Moscow and its traditions. The new city frightened him. The reforms repelled him. To Peter, Alexei was not merely disappointing, he was dangerous. Peter saw in his son the possibility of reversal, of everything he had built being undone by a ruler who would retreat into the past. The thought was intolerable. The tension between them grew steadily. Peter confronted Alexei repeatedly, demanded that he change, that he learn, that he become worthy of the future Peter envisioned, or else renounce the throne entirely and enter a monastery. Alexei hesitated, then he fled. He escaped Russia and sought refuge abroad, appealing to foreign powers, Peter's rivals, for protection. To Peter, this was not a family dispute. It was treason. The heir to the empire had defected. Peter promised forgiveness, swore solemn oaths. Alexei returned, believing, hoping that reconciliation was possible. He was arrested immediately. The trial was swift, the outcome inevitable. Under interrogation, Alexei was accused of conspiring against the state. Whether he truly did or not mattered little. The threat he represented was enough. Peter oversaw the process himself. The son was imprisoned in the same fortress that symbolized the new capital. The father's city became the son's cage. Alexei died in 1718, officially of illness. In reality, after days of questioning and punishment that his body could not endure. Peter had sacrificed his own blood to secure his vision. It was the final confirmation of the path he had chosen. Nothing, not tradition, not faith, not family, would be allowed to stand in the way of what he believed Russia must become. By the time St. Petersburg neared completion, Russia was unrecognizable. It had an empire, a professional army, a navy built from nothing, a bureaucracy organized by rank and service rather than birth alone. It also had deeper serfdom, heavier demands, and a state that reached further into the lives of its people than ever before. Peter had not freed Russia. He had mobilized it, and yet, for all his planning, for all his discipline, Peter made one fatal omission. He did not decide what would happen after him. He had changed the rules of succession, allowing the ruler to choose any heir, but he never named one. When he died in 1725, exhausted, ill, his vast energy finally spent, he left behind not a plan, but a vacuum. The city stood, the empire endured. The future, once again, was uncertain. St. Petersburg glittered on the water, and beneath its beauty, the foundations held fast. For now. In the next part, the empire Peter forged will stumble without its architect. Power will shift hands rapidly, and the throne, once stabilized by quiet endurance and then seized by overwhelming force, will become a prize fought over in shadows. The river flows steadily. The city breathes. And Russia waits to see who will stand at the center next. After the giant, a throne, without an anchor. When Peter died, Russia did not collapse, but it did not rest either. The great force that had driven everything forward, the voice that commanded, the hands that built, the will that tolerated no delay, was suddenly gone. What remained was an empire shaped by one man's energy, but not yet accustomed to governing itself. Peter had centralized power with extraordinary success, and that was the problem. He had bent institutions around his personality. He had replaced custom with command. He had taught Russia to move, but only when pushed. And now there was no one pushing. The moment his breath left him, the question that hovered in every palace corridor and guard room was simple and dangerous. Who decides now? Peter had changed the law of succession. No longer was the throne passed automatically from father to eldest son. The ruler could choose any successor. It was meant to prevent weakness. It was meant to ensure continuity of vision. But Peter had never named one. Whether through oversight, indecision, or the belief that he still had time, he left the question unanswered. And in doing so, he transformed the throne into something new. Not a birthright, a prize. The power Peter had forged was immense. Command over armies, over cities, over resources, over people. And now that power sat unclaimed, waiting to be seized. The first to step forward was his wife. Catherine was not born noble. She had not been educated for rule. She could barely read or write, but she had lived beside Peter long enough to understand the machinery of power. More importantly, she had allies. The guards, Peter's guards. The same regiments he had trained, promoted, and trusted now held the balance. With their support, Catherine was proclaimed ruler. There was little resistance. The country was tired. Stability mattered more than pedigree. She ruled briefly. Her reign was not transformative. It did not need to be. It was a pause, a holding pattern. Advisors governed. The empire breathed. When she died, the throne passed again, this time to a child. Peter II was young, impressionable, and surrounded by factions eager to guide him. The court shifted its influence once more, drifting away from the strict discipline Peter had enforced. Moscow regained prominence. Old habits crept back, and then, suddenly, the boy died. Smallpox ended his reign almost as quietly as it had begun. Once again, the throne stood empty. What followed was not chaos in the streets, but tension behind closed doors. The nobility searched for a candidate who could restore order without threatening their own positions. They wanted legitimacy without dominance. They chose Anna. She was related to the Romanovs, but distant enough to feel manageable. She accepted the crown under conditions, agreements meant to limit her power, but once installed, she discarded them. Power, once tasted, is rarely shared. Her reign was marked by formality and distance. Foreign advisors rose in influence. Court life grew rigid. The nobility chafed quietly. Russia endured, but the sense of direction Peter had imposed was fading. When Anna died, another child followed. Then another shift. Finally, Peter's own daughter, Elizabeth, stepped forward. She was different. Elizabeth understood symbolism. She understood spectacle. She understood loyalty. When she marched into the palace at night, wearing a military breastplate, and reminded the guards whose daughter she was, they followed her without hesitation. It was a bloodless coup. Elizabeth ruled longer and more confidently than her immediate predecessors. She restored some of Peter's spirit, favoring grandeur, patronage, and authority, but without his relentless drive. She enjoyed the throne. She stabilized it. She did not modernize further. And like others before her, she faced a familiar problem, an heir. Elizabeth had no legitimate children. She had to choose. Her choice would matter more than she realized. She selected her nephew, a young man raised in a foreign court, educated in foreign ways, and largely indifferent to Russia itself. He admired foreign rulers. He spoke the language awkwardly. He understood little of the land he would one day govern. His name was Peter III. When Elizabeth died, the empire passed to him quietly, and almost immediately, things began to unravel. Peter III was not malicious. He was not cruel. He was simply out of step with his position. He admired foreign armies more than his own. He dismissed traditions without understanding their importance. He alienated the guards, the church, and the nobility in quick succession. His rule lasted months. Behind the scenes, his wife was watching. She had arrived in Russia years earlier as a teenage bride from a small German principality. She had learned the language carefully, converted publicly, observed court politics with patience. She read widely, she listened, she waited. Her name was Catherine. When the moment came, she acted decisively. With the support of the guards and key officials, she took the throne in a swift and efficient coup. Her husband was arrested, forced to abdicate, and soon after died under circumstances that raised no real doubt. Catherine ruled, and she ruled well. She studied philosophy, corresponded with thinkers, sponsored art and education, expanded the empire's borders, strengthened administration, presented Russia to Europe as enlightened, sophisticated, modern. But beneath the elegance, the structure Peter had built remained unchanged. Serfdom deepened, authority centralized further, reform served the state first. Catherine understood Peter's lesson. Russia could not afford weakness. Her reign restored confidence. The empire expanded. Prestige grew. And for a time, it seemed that the Romanovs had found balance between force and culture, authority and refinement. Yet the pattern endured. Strong rulers stabilized the throne. Weak ones exposed it. The system did not correct itself. It lurched from hand to hand, depending entirely on the individual at the center. Peter's legacy was everywhere. In the army, in the navy, in the capital, in the idea that Russia could be remade by will alone. But so was his omission. By binding the state so tightly to the ruler, he had ensured that every succession would be a moment of uncertainty. Every death would reopen the question of control. The empire moved forward, but it did so unevenly, surging under giants, stalling under caretakers. The land endured, the people adapted, and the throne waited, always, for the next figure strong enough to command it. In the next part of our story, Russia will reach its greatest height on the European stage. It will face its most formidable enemy. And a Romanov will ride at the center of history, convinced that destiny itself has chosen him. The empire is vast, the stakes are rising, and the world beyond Russia is about to come knocking. Fire from the west. Catherine's death did not bring quiet. It brought inheritance. The empire she left behind was vast, confident, and admired abroad. Its court glittered, its borders stretched, its armies were respected. Yet beneath the polished surface lay old tensions, questions about authority, reform, and the future that no single reign had resolved. Her son, Paul, ruled briefly and uneasily. His rule ended the way so many Romanov chapters did, in violence within palace walls. And from that moment of shock and silence, power passed to a new figure, Alexander. He came to the throne young, handsome, and uncertain. He had been raised on the language of ideals, of enlightened rule, of law, of moderation. Tutors had spoken to him of constitutions and restraint. He listened, he believed, or at least he wanted to. But he also carried a burden few rulers ever escape. He had come to power over the dead body of his father. The knowledge settled into him like a shadow. Guilt followed him everywhere, quiet but persistent. It shaped his temperament, softened his confidence, sharpened his introspection. Alexander ruled gently at first. He eased censorship, released prisoners, spoke of reform. He surrounded himself with young advisors who dreamed of a more flexible state. For a moment, It felt as though Russia might finally evolve without breaking. And then, the world intruded. From the west came a force unlike any Russia had faced before. Not a dynasty, not a coalition of kings, but a single man whose rise had been forged in revolution and war. Napoleon Bonaparte. He moved faster than old empires could react. His armies marched with precision and speed. His victories reshaped borders and shattered assumptions. Thrones fell, alliances shifted, Europe trembled. Alexander watched closely. At first, Russia opposed him, then admired him, then feared him. Their relationship swung between rivalry and fascination. They met not as monarchs bound by tradition, but as men shaped by ambition. On a raft in the middle of a river, they spoke as equals. They imagined dividing influence, east and west, order restored through strength. It was an illusion. Empires do not share the sky easily. Napoleon's demands grew. His economic warfare choked Russian trade. The balance tilted, respect eroded. And then, in the summer of 1812, the illusion shattered. Napoleon invaded Russia. It was the largest army Europe had ever assembled. Hundreds of thousands of men crossing borders with confidence and certainty. They expected battle. They expected surrender. They expected the end to come quickly. Russia did not give it to them. Instead, the land retreated. Villages emptied, crops burned, supplies vanished. The army fell back again and again, yielding space rather than ground. It was not cowardice. It was strategy shaped by geography and patience. The land itself became a weapon. Napoleon marched deeper, chasing resolution that never arrived. His army stretched thin. Hunger gnawed. Morale faltered. When battle finally came at Borodino, it was savage and inconclusive. Blood soaked the fields. Neither side claimed true victory. The Russians withdrew once more. Napoleon entered Moscow expecting triumph. He found silence. The city was empty, and then it burned. Flames consumed homes, churches, streets. Smoke darkened the sky. The ancient heart of Russia was sacrificed to deny it to the invader. Alexander did not waver. He did not negotiate. He waited. Winter arrived, not dramatically, inevitably. Cold seeped into bones. Horses died. Supply lines snapped. The retreat began, not as a march, but as a collapse. Men fell behind. Equipment was abandoned. Discipline dissolved. The vast army that had crossed into Russia with confidence disintegrated on the way out. Russia had not chased victory. It had endured until victory came to it. Alexander emerged transformed. The hesitant reformer became a figure convinced of destiny. He believed that Providence had spared Russia for a reason, that he himself had been chosen to stand against revolution and chaos. When Russian troops entered Paris, Alexander rode with them, a Romanov at the center of Europe. At the height of power, something shifted inside him. The man who had spoken of constitutions now feared them. The ruler who had flirted with reform now saw revolution as contagion. The memory of his father's murder, of France's upheaval, of cities burning, all fused into a single conviction: order must be preserved at any cost. Alexander returned home changed. He formed alliances not to expand liberty, but to contain it. He spoke the language of morality and faith. He saw himself as guardian of stability in a world unmoored. Russia, once again, turned inward. Reform stalled. Surveillance grew. Dissent became suspect. The empire rested on victory but hardened against change. Alexander withdrew gradually, from court life, from governance, from certainty. He became introspective, spiritual, distant. Decisions slowed, advisors hesitated, and then, unexpectedly, he died. Far from the capital, far from ceremony. His death sparked rumors immediately, stories of escape, of renunciation, of a ruler who had abandoned power to wander in prayer. Truth blurred into legend, as it so often did in Russia, but practical matters could not wait. Alexander left no clear successor. Once again, the throne wavered. Confusion spread through the ranks. Oaths were sworn and unsworn. For weeks, Russia hovered in uncertainty. And into that uncertainty stepped men who had marched across Europe, men who had seen constitutions work, men who believed that Russia could change without collapsing. They gathered in the cold. They waited. They raised their voices. The moment would pass quickly, but its echo would shape the century to come. As the embers of Moscow's fire cooled and the memory of invasion settled into history, Russia stood victorious and uneasy. It had survived the greatest test of its age, but survival had come at a cost. The empire had learned again what it always seemed to learn, that strength could repel enemies but not questions, and the questions were waiting, silent, patient, unanswered. In the next part, the silence will break. The guards will turn their cannons inward, and a new Romanov will choose order over compromise, setting Russia on a harder path. The snow begins to fall once more, and the empire listens, order at any cost. The silence after Alexander's death did not feel peaceful. It felt suspended. For weeks, Russia hovered between names, between oaths, between futures. No one seemed certain who stood at the center. Commands were issued, then quietly reversed. Allegiances were sworn, then reconsidered. Even the army hesitated. This hesitation was dangerous. In a land trained to fear absence of authority, uncertainty itself became a threat. Some officers, shaped by years of marching across Europe, believed this pause was opportunity. They had seen constitutions limit power without destroying states. They had watched parliaments debate without collapsing armies. They returned to Russia, convinced that strength and law did not have to be enemies. They were wrong about timing. On a cold December morning in 1825, soldiers gathered in a public square. They refused to swear allegiance. They demanded clarity. Some spoke of limits on power. Others barely understood the words they repeated. The moment was brief. Nicholas, the younger brother who would take the throne, did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. He did not appeal. He ordered artillery brought forward and fired into the assembled ranks. Grape shot tore through coats and banners alike. The rebellion ended almost as soon as it began. The lesson was unmistakable. Reform, Nicholas believed, led only to disorder. Disorder led to weakness, and weakness invited destruction. His reign began not with promises, but with certainty. Nicholas ruled as an engineer rules a structure. He believed the state must be rigid, reinforced, sealed against pressure. He did not trust flexibility. He trusted discipline. Russia, in his vision, was a fortress. Its foundations were obedience. Its walls were censorship. Its sentries were police and informers. He formalized an ideology that sounded reassuring in its simplicity: autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality. The ruler was absolute. The church unified belief. The people were bound by shared identity. To enforce this order, surveillance expanded. Letters were opened, conversations overheard. Universities watched closely, writers censored. Even metaphors were suspect. The state listened constantly, and yet, beneath the rigid exterior, change was happening anyway. Factories appeared, railways crept outward, cities grew, peasants left villages when they could. Ideas slipped through borders no matter how tightly they were guarded. Russia was modernizing unevenly, mechanically, but not politically. When war came again, the weakness of this imbalance was exposed. In the Crimean War, Russia faced opponents whose technology and organization had outpaced its own. The army fought bravely, but its systems failed. Supply lines collapsed, equipment lagged behind. The fortress Nicholas had built cracked under pressure. Nicholas did not live to see the reckoning fully unfold. He died, believing he had failed to leave his son a stable empire. That son, Alexander, inherited defeat and truth. Alexander II did not dream of reform. He feared catastrophe. He understood that the structures holding Russia together were no longer strong enough to withstand the world outside. His most famous decision was not born of idealism. It was born of calculation. Serfdom, binding millions to the land, had once provided stability. Now it strangled productivity, mobility, and morale. The army was filled with men who fought because they had no choice. The economy moved slowly. Discontent simmered everywhere. Alexander chose to act. He freed the serfs. On paper, it was monumental. Millions were no longer property. Families were no longer owned outright. The old order shifted. In practice, freedom arrived tangled in obligation. Land had to be purchased. Payments stretched for decades. Villages were bound together in communal responsibility that limited movement. The reform satisfied no one completely. Nobles lost control, peasants gained debt, the state gained responsibility. Yet something irreversible had happened. The old world had cracked. With reform came expectation. With expectation came impatience. A new generation, educated but constrained, began to question not just policy, but structure itself. Some believed change could be gradual. Others believed it could only come through force. Radical groups formed quietly. They debated. They planned. They watched the ruler closely. To them, the Tsar was not a protector or reformer. He was the keystone holding the system together. Remove the keystone and the structure would fall. Attempts were made. Plots failed. Bombs misfired. Fate intervened again and again, until it didn't. One winter afternoon, Alexander was mortally wounded by an explosive thrown at his feet. He died not in battle, but on a street, carried back to his palace bleeding. Ironically, documents proposing further reform lay unsigned nearby. The lesson his son learned was immediate and absolute. Reform invites violence. Alexander III reversed course. He tightened control. He expanded policing. He emphasized strength and tradition. He ruled without apology. The empire quieted again, but the quiet was brittle. When he died, the crown passed to his son, Nicholas. He was gentle, educated, devoted to family, and unprepared. He believed in autocracy because he believed it was his duty, not because he understood its machinery. He inherited a state stretched between centuries, between tradition and industry, between obedience and unrest. He meant well, but meaning well was not enough. The pressures accumulated slowly at first, then faster. War exposed weakness. Protest revealed alienation. Concessions came late and half-formed. Authority eroded. The system the Romanovs had built, strength without flexibility, had reached its limit. When collapse came, it did not come as invasion. It came as hunger, as exhaustion, as refusal. Nicholas abdicated quietly. No banners fell, no palace burned immediately. The dynasty ended not with spectacle, but with resignation. The Romanovs were imprisoned, moved, hidden away, and in the chaos that followed, fear triumphed over mercy. In a basement, far from ceremony, the family was killed. Not as symbols, as a problem to be removed. The dynasty that had ruled for centuries ended in minutes. What remained was not freedom, but another form of certainty. Another claim to absolute power, another ruler promising order. The names changed, the structure endured. Russia moved forward carrying its history like sediment, layer upon layer of belief, fear, endurance, and force. The Romanovs were gone, but the questions they lived with did not leave with them. They settled, they waited, and they would rise again in new forms, under new banners, repeating old patterns in unfamiliar voices. The night deepens, the story quiets, and history exhales, never finished, only resting. What remains after the crown? When the cellar fell silent, the dynasty was already gone. The Romanovs did not end in that room. They ended long before, layer by layer, decision by decision, generation by generation. The final act was brutal, yes, intimate, unforgiving. But history had been narrowing toward it for centuries. The bullets and bayonets were not the cause. They were the punctuation. What vanished in that basement was not merely a family. It was an idea. For 300 years, the Romanovs had taught Russia something powerful and difficult, that survival depended on a single center of gravity. That the land could not be held together by compromise alone. That when pressure mounted, strength mattered more than sympathy. They ruled through fire and frost, through reform and repression, through brilliance and blindness. Some were giants who reshaped the state, others were caretakers who preserved it. A few were neither and paid the price, but all of them governed within the same assumption: that Russia could not be ruled lightly. Peter had forged this assumption into steel. He had built a modern state on ancient obedience. He had shown that speed could overcome tradition, but only through force. He had turned Russia into an empire, and in doing so, made power indivisible. Catherine refined the lesson. She demonstrated that elegance could coexist with control, that enlightenment could decorate authority without loosening it. She sold Europe a vision of civilization while tightening the grip at home. Alexander V revealed the cost of moral contradiction. He defeated revolution abroad and feared it within. He saved Europe and mistrusted his own people. Victory transformed him from reformer into guardian of order. Nicholas I made certainty his religion. He sealed the empire against doubt and built a fortress that looked unbreakable until the world changed faster than walls could hold. Alexander II tried to open the gates carefully. He loosened chains without dismantling the structure. The result was expectation without satisfaction, motion without direction. His son closed the gates again, and Nicholas II inherited a system that required giants, but offered him only duty. He was not cruel. He was not indifferent. He was simply unequal to the weight placed upon him. He believed in the crown as obligation, not instrument. He loved his family more than power. He trusted where suspicion was required, and history is unforgiving to gentle men standing atop rigid systems. The Romanovs fell not because they were evil, nor because Russia rejected order. They fell because the form of order they built could no longer bend. When all reform must come from above, pressure builds below. When compromise is forbidden, rupture becomes inevitable. When authority cannot share space, it must either dominate completely or disappear. The empire chose disappearance. What followed did not erase the Romanov legacy. It absorbed it. The new rulers spoke a different language. They rejected crowns and churches, dynasties and divine right. They promised equality. They promised justice. They promised an end to old chains. Yet the structure they inherited shaped them more than they admitted. Power remained centralized. Opposition was crushed. The state demanded sacrifice. The whip changed hands. The chair at the center was never left empty. Those who ruled after the Romanovs ruled as new autocrats, armed not with crowns, but with ideology. They built cities, forced labor, commanded armies, reshaped society through decree. They mobilized millions, They demanded endurance. The names were different. The rhythm was familiar. This is the paradox the Romanovs leave behind. They did not merely rule Russia. They trained it. They trained the land to expect authority concentrated, decisive, absolute. They taught generations that chaos was worse than repression, that absence was deadlier than control. And so, when the dynasty ended, the habit remained. History rarely offers clean breaks. It offers continuity disguised as revolution. The Romanovs were not monsters nor saints. They were humans shaped by an extreme environment and asked to perform an impossible task: govern a land vast enough to swallow moderation. Some rose to the challenge with force, others faltered under its weight. All paid a price. Their story is not one of simple tyranny or simple tragedy. It is a story of systems outliving their architects, of solutions that solve one century and break the next, of power accumulated so successfully that it becomes impossible to release safely. In the end, the Romanovs did what history so often demands. They held the center until holding it broke them. Russia moved on, but it carried the memory, the expectation of strength, the fear of emptiness, the longing for order. These did not die in 1918, they simply changed uniforms. And so the Romanov story does not close like a book. It settles like snow, layer upon layer, quietly shaping the ground beneath future footsteps. If history whispers anything as we drift away from this tale, it is not judgment, it is understanding. That power, once concentrated, never vanishes. That extremes demand response, and that nations, like people, remember the lessons that kept them alive. The candles go out now, the bells fade. The long road of history stretches onward, unchanged, patient, waiting for the next name to stand at the center. Sleep gently. The past is never finished. It is only resting. And now, the story grows quiet. The snow settles over palaces and villages alike. The echoes of crowns, cannons, and whispered prayers soften into memory. What once thundered through history now moves gently, like breath slowing before sleep. The Romanovs are gone, but their world does not vanish. It lingers, in stone, in stories, in the long rhythms of a land shaped by endurance and belief. Their lives were not legends carved in marble, but human lives, heavy with duty, fear, love, and impossible choices. Tonight we leave them not in judgment, but in understanding. A family bound to a country too vast to be ruled gently. A country shaped by extremes, learning again and again how power rises, hardens, and passes on. As you rest, let the noise of history fade. Let the great questions loosen their grip. The past has spoken, and now it sleeps. Thank you for listening to Slumber Scrolls, where history whispers you to sleep. Close your eyes. The night is calm, and the story will be waiting when you return.